On the 24th of June 1942, the commander of the Volkhov Front, Kirill Afanasyevich Meretskov, finally signed the order to withdraw. The Second Shock Army could break out of the encirclement. The corridor held by units of the 37th Rifle Division was still open, 800 meters of living earth between two German groupings. 800 meters that the Germans raked with fire from everything they had. But at the Army headquarters, this order had not been expected for several weeks. They had been waiting for it since May, when the ring began to tighten. Since April, when the last supply line, the narrow-gauge railway through Myasnoy Bor, was virtually severed. Since March, when it became clear that the offensive was not moving forward, but was slowly bogging down in the swamps. The order came. But those who could have left first, the Army commander, Lieutenant General Andrei Andreevich Vlasov, and his staff, had by this point already disappeared from the troops' disposition. They left quietly, without an official transfer of command, without a radio signal, without explanations for those who remained. A few hours before the Germans finally slammed the corridor shut, thousands of people were moving through Myasnoy Bor under artillery fire. Not by order, simply because there was no other way. But a significant part of the army never made it out. Not because they didn't try, but because by that time, the men had been subsisting for months on tree bark, leather belts, and horse carcasses. Because they had been abandoned, slowly, step by step, decision by decision, long before the order was written. To understand how this became possible, one must go back to the winter of 41-42. To the moment when all this began as a plan to save Leningrad. The winter of 1941-42. Leningrad had been under siege for 4 months. Behind the line of the German ring, people were dying, not from bullets, but from hunger. The daily bread ration for workers was 250 grams. For office workers and children, 125. This was not a survival ration. It was a dying ration. At the Stavka, they understood, if the blockade was not broken by spring, the city would not survive. The decision was made to strike across the Volkhov River, break through to Lyuban, reach the rear of the German 18th Army, and break the ring from the south. On paper, the plan looked logical. The direction was chosen correctly. The straight-line distance to the Leningrad positions was about 67 kilometers. Not much. But there was no straight line here. Between Volkhov and Leningrad lay the Leningrad Oblast in the winter of 42. Forests, peat bogs, frozen rivers, and an almost complete absence of roads. The only highway, the October Railway, was in German hands. Any movement of large troop masses in this area required building roads right in the forest, right in the swamps, right under fire. This was known to anyone who looked at the map for more than 5 minutes. On the 7th of January 1942, the Second Shock Army went on the offensive. At that moment, it was commanded by General Nikolai Kuzmich Klikov. The army had been created literally in a few weeks from units that had not yet finished forming. Divisions were under strength. Equipment was lacking. Some of the soldiers were armed with whatever could be hastily gathered. The first days of the offensive yielded results. The German positions at Myasnoy Bor were breached. The army entered the breakthrough. It seemed the plan was working. But within 2 weeks, the speed of movement sharply dropped. The army moved into the forests and swamps, which the Germans had not bothered to defend, simply because it was impossible to supply through them normally. Columns stretched along the only clearings. Horse-drawn transport got stuck in the snow. Trucks could not pass where there was no corduroy road. By February, the army had advanced 50 to 60 kilometers deep into the German rear. On the map, this looked like a breakthrough. On the ground, it looked like a long, narrow wedge driven into the swamp with a single supply bottleneck, the narrow-gauge railway through Myasnoy Bor that was raked by fire from both sides. The Germans saw this, and they began to press on the base of the wedge. March 1942. German troops under the command of General Lyuban strike at the flanks of the breakthrough. The main objective is Myasnoy Bor. If the corridor is blocked, the army would be in complete encirclement, unable to receive ammunition, food, or reinforcements. The Soviet command reacts. Several attempts are made to widen the corridor. Several times it succeeds, a narrow slit through which some supplies can be dragged. But each time, the Germans close it again. There is a change of army commander. General Volkhov falls seriously ill. In his place, Andrei Vlasov is appointed, a man with a decent reputation at that time. He commanded the 20th Army near Moscow in the winter of 41-42 and took part in the counteroffensive. He is known at the Stavka. They are counting on him. Vlasov arrives at the army in April. By this time, the army's situation has already seriously deteriorated. The corridor operates intermittently. The bread ration for soldiers is 200 grams per day. Shells are in short supply. Air support is practically absent, not because there is no aviation, but because operational coordination between the army and aviation units was never properly organized. Vlasov writes reports to the front headquarters. He reports that the army needs supplies. He reports that without ammunition deliveries, an offensive is impossible. He reports that the situation worsens with each week. His reports are received. They are answered with promises. April, May, 1942. This is perhaps the most important and at the same time the least discussed period of the entire operation. In April, a personnel reorganization takes place which will personally be named one of the key factors of the disaster several years later. The Volkhov Front, to which the Second Shock Army was subordinated, is abolished. The army is transferred to the command of the Leningrad Front, commanded by General Mikhail Kozin. The decision is made in Moscow, and it has its own logic. Since the army is operating on the approaches to Leningrad, let the Leningrad headquarters command it. On paper, reasonable. In practice, a disaster. The Leningrad Front headquarters is in Leningrad. The army is in the swamps near Lyuban. The distance between them is not just kilometers, but also the front line, an air corridor that operates irregularly, and several days for transmitting any order through intermediate instances. Communication with the army works intermittently. Radio stations fail. Couriers sometimes cannot be delivered on time. Kozin receives command of an army he has never seen, in an area he does not know, with supply lines he has never controlled from the start. And the army begins to suffocate. Here, it is necessary to pause and look at the figures that make everything happening even more stark. By May 1942, Lindemann's German 18th Army occupies positions around the breakthrough. The Germans create an inner and outer ring. Inside, Soviet units. Outside, there were German reserves being transferred along proper roads, across proper bridges with proper supplies. By this time, the Second Shock Army had expended most of its ammunition. The guns were silent. There were no shells. The tanks stood idle. There was no fuel. The soldiers held their positions literally with their bare hands. A few bullets per rifle, one grenade launcher per company, and a hunger that had already reached a stage by May where people were physically incapable of moving normally. Doctor of Historical Sciences Alexei Isayev, who studied this operation using Ministry of Defense archives, recorded, "The daily ration in the army by May amounted to between 50 and 80 grams of hardtack per person, lower than any siege ration. People were not dying in battle. They were dying from exhaustion right on their positions. Several attempts were made to break through the corridor from the outside. Several times they succeeded, a narrow gap through which some supplies could be dragged. But each time the Germans closed it again. At the front headquarters in Leningrad, meetings were held about what to do next. There were two options: either increase efforts to relieve the army, or issue an order to withdraw while there was still some chance. Kozin did not give the order to withdraw. The official logic? The army could still accomplish its mission. The unofficial reality? To give the order to withdraw meant admitting the failure of the entire operation. May 1942. The Germans strike at the neck of the corridor near Myasnoy Bor. This time they manage to cut it off completely. The Second Shock Army finds itself encircled. In the ring, according to various estimates, were about 80,000 people. The exact number is difficult to establish even from archival documents. Some units did not have complete personnel lists. Some had been transferred from other formations literally just before the encirclement. 80,000 people. In the swamps, without proper supplies. 80,000 is roughly the population of a medium-sized Russian town. Imagine that this entire town ended up in a forest, without food, without medicine, without the ability to call anyone and explain what was happening. The corridor was closed. But no, not entirely. Again and again, Soviet units from the outside tried to break open a gap. Again and again, they succeeded for a few hours or days. Through this gap, they managed to transfer some food, a negligible amount compared to what was needed. Through it, some of the wounded got out. But the order for a general withdrawal still did not come. On the 9th of June, 1942, the Stavka finally removed Kozin from command of the Leningrad Front. The Volkhov Front was reinstated. Command was returned to Meretskov. This decision was called a reinstatement, as if it were a technical correction of the organizational structure. In reality, it was an admission. In the month and a half under Kozin's command, the army had gone from a difficult situation to a catastrophic one. The army was not supplied. The army was not given an order to break out. The army was not relieved. Meretskov got back an army that had not been saved in that month and a half. He immediately issued the order to withdraw. The date of the order was around the 20th of June. By this time, the corridor was open again, held by units of the 37th Rifle Division, 800 meters wide, completely exposed to fire. But the army was already at its limit. People weighed 40 to 45 kilograms. Moving across open swamp under artillery fire was not a march for them. It was the limit of what the human body was capable of doing at all. This is what happened in the corridor near Myasnoy Bor in the last days of June 1942. The width of the corridor was 800 meters. The Germans swept it with artillery and machine gun fire from both sides. Through this corridor went people, those who could still walk. They moved at night, trying to use the darkness. The Germans illuminated the swamp with flares and fired at the moving silhouettes. Those who made it through were bandaged, fed, and sent to the rear. Many were carried on stretchers, not because they were wounded, but because they could not move normally. Those who did not manage to get through before the corridor closed were left behind. On the 24th of June, German units closed the ring again. The corridor was shut for good. Part of the army had managed to get out. Part had not. What happened in the swamps after this, Soviet historiography for a long time called a heroic demise. In reality, it was the agony of several thousand people who were left without command, without supplies, and without food in June, when the ice had melted and the ground had turned into a quagmire. They continued to fight for a few more days, in scattered groups, without overall command. And now, about where the army commander was at this time. Lieutenant General Vlasov left the army's location presumably on the 22nd of June, 1942. Together with a small group of staff officers, he headed east, trying to make his way out through the forests on his own. There was no official handover of command. No army order about who was assuming command was issued. On the 12th of July, 1942, Vlasov was handed over to German soldiers by the residents of the village of Tukovezy in the Leningrad Oblast. According to the official Soviet version, voluntarily. According to some German documents, he was handed over by local residents. Both versions are recorded in different sources, and historians still have not reached a consensus. For understanding the fate of the army, this is not so important. What is important is something else. The commander left. While his army was still fighting in the swamps, he was already outside of it. In German captivity, Vlasov agreed to cooperate a few months later and would lead the so-called Russian Liberation Army, a collaborationist formation that fought on the side of Germany. This would make his name synonymous with betrayal in Soviet historiography. But for understanding the Lyuban operation, his betrayal is the final point. Not the cause of the disaster. The disaster happened earlier and for other reasons. To understand why the army perished, three things need to be examined separately: supply, command, and time. First, supply. The Lyuban operation from the very beginning was built on logistics that could not withstand any serious strain. The only supply line, a narrow-gauge railway through Myasnoy Bor, was initially designed for low freight traffic. For supplying an army of 80,000 people, it was fundamentally insufficient. According to calculations published in a study by military historian Sergei Yakovlev, the army required about 500 tons of cargo daily: ammunition, food, fuel, medicine. Via the narrow-gauge railway through Myasnoy Bor, during the best periods they managed to deliver 100 to 150 tons. During the worst, nothing, because the Germans swept the tracks with fire or destroyed them with airstrikes. This disproportion was known from the very beginning of the operation. It was not rectified. Why? Because building a proper road through a swamp in winter under combat conditions meant months of work and significant resources. They were not available. This is part 2 of 6. They chose to begin the operation with what they had, hoping for a swift breakthrough. When the swift breakthrough did not materialize, the army became a hostage of its own logistical system. Second, command. The Lyuban operation suffered from fragmented command throughout its existence. The Volkhov Front and the Leningrad Front operated in the same area, but with different tasks and different chains of command. Coordination between them was weak. When in April the Volkhov Front was abolished and the army was transferred to Kozin, the situation qualitatively worsened. Kozin commanded an army that was located dozens of kilometers from his headquarters, behind the front line with unstable communications. He had practically no operational capabilities for effectively managing this army. There is another detail that is rarely mentioned. Vlasov, who assumed command of the army in April, repeatedly requested permission from Kozin to withdraw, or at least to regroup. According to surviving archival documents, some of these requests received no timely response. To others, a reply was received demanding the continuation of offensive actions. The command, to advance, under conditions where the army has no ammunition and no food, that is not an order. It is a death sentence. Third, time. From the moment it became clear that the operation would not achieve its objectives until the moment the order to withdraw was given, several months passed. This was the time during which the army could have been saved. Not all of it, losses were already great, but a significant part of it. Instead, the command continued to hope that the situation could be turned around. It continued to send orders to advance into the encirclement. It continued to promise reinforcements and supplies, which never arrived in the required volume. Each week of delay cost people, not combat losses, losses from hunger and disease right in their positions. There is another aspect of this story that practically never made it into Soviet textbooks. On the 16th of October, 1941, several months before the start of the Lyuban operation, there was panic in Moscow. Documents were being burned, highways were being blocked, people were fleeing east. This was not written about in Soviet textbooks, nor about the scale of the Vyazma pocket. Soviet historiography spoke even less about the army that perished in the swamps near Lyuban, because the history of the Second Shock Army is a history of systemic failure. Failure of intelligence, which failed to correctly assess the terrain conditions and German reserves. Failure of logistics, which began to be built only after the operation had started. Failure of command, which for too long could not make the decision to withdraw. And failure of subordination, when the reorganization in April deprived the army of effective management at the most critical moment. Vlasov became a convenient figure upon whom all of this could be blamed. A traitor commander instead of a systemic analysis of the failure. His name closed the topic for decades. But the people who died in the swamps did not die from Vlasov's betrayal. They died earlier, when their army was no longer supplied, when they were not given the order to break out, and when the decisions that needed to be made in March were postponed until June. The number of people who did not return from the swamps of Lyuban is estimated differently by historians. The total losses of the Second Shock Army during the period of the operation, killed, died of wounds and disease, taken prisoner, amount, according to various estimates, from 50 to 70,000 people. The exact figure has still not been established. 70,000. That is more than the population of many district centers. Most of them did not die in battle. They died of hunger, scurvy, and dystrophy in a swamp that their command called a theater of military operations, but never managed to properly supply. Myasnoy Bor, a village in the Novgorod region. Today there is a monument there. Every year search expeditions go there. The earth still holds the remains of those who were not found and not buried in 42. In the last decade of each May, volunteers work in these places, digging, searching, identifying by dog tags if they are lucky. Archival documents were gradually declassified, some in the 90s, some already in the 2000s. Some, according to some reports, are still classified. This is not a history of victory. This is a history of how an army was sent into a swamp without providing it with supplies or proper command or a timely decision to withdraw. Of how bureaucratic delay and an unwillingness to admit failure cost tens of thousands of people their lives. And here there is a question that remains open even after 8 decades. Could the army have been saved? Military historians who have worked with declassified materials, in particular Alexei Isayev and Mikhail Meltyukov, point out, the technical capability to withdraw a significant part of the troops existed as early as March, April 42. The corridor was functioning. Supplies, albeit insufficient, existed. The rate of losses from hunger had not yet reached a critical point. To make the decision to withdraw required political will. To admit that the operation had failed and its continuation was leading to the destruction of the army. Not to an honorable retreat preserving the front, not to a strategic regrouping, but to a simple extraction of people from the trap while they could still walk. This will was lacking. First, in March, when the situation was difficult but not hopeless. Then, in April, when it became critical. Then, in May, when the army was already dying. The corridor closed on the 24th of June. Part of the army got out. The larger part remained. Today, in some archives, there are reports that Vlasov sent to the front headquarters in May, June 42. The tone of these documents is dry, military, bureaucratic, as befits official reports. But through this form, what was actually happening emerges. The army is deprived of the ability to conduct active combat operations due to a shortage of ammunition and food. Personnel are physically exhausted to the limit. I request permission to withdraw. These reports were received. They were answered with demands to hold positions and await help, which never arrived in the required volume. People continued to die in their positions. There is a certain logic in Vlasov subsequently betraying. A person whom the system used and then abandoned sometimes decides that obligations are mutual. This is not a justification. Betrayal is betrayal, and its consequences were real. Thousands of people in the Russian Liberation Army fought against their own country. But the explanation for what happened near Lyuban lies not in Vlasov's personal morality. It lies in the system that sent an army into a swamp without adequate supplies, changed the command structure 3 times at the most critical moment, and for too long could not admit that the operation had failed. Myasnoy Bor. This name became the unofficial name of this entire tragedy, the swamp through which a narrow-gauge railway ran. The place where 800 meters of open ground became the final boundary between life and death for tens of thousands of people. Search teams work there every year. Every year they find new remains. Each year, a few dozen people are identified by their medallions or documents. The rest are buried as unknowns. Over the 80 years that have passed since June 1942, the swamp has not yielded all its dead. Military history tends to turn every tragedy into a lesson. The lesson of Lyuban is simple and cruel. An army must not be sent where ammunition and bread cannot be properly delivered. The decision to retreat must not be postponed due to prestige or a reluctance to admit the failure of an operation. Command cannot control troops without having proper communication with them. All of this was known before the operation began. Some of these problems were visible from the first weeks of the offensive. Nevertheless, the army spent almost half a year in the swamps, and most of those who entered these swamps did not come out. The question of whether this could have been prevented remains in the archives, in those reports that were sent and received, in those decisions that were made or not made, in those months that passed between difficult and impossible? The answer to it is inconvenient for any system that prefers heroism to an honest analysis of mistakes. That is precisely why this story was not told for so long. That is precisely why it must be told. Part 2. The logistics of death. To understand why the Second Shock Army perished, one question must be examined separately. How was the army supplied under these conditions at all? Any offensive operation requires an uninterrupted flow of supplies from the rear to the front line. Ammunition, fuel, food, medicine. Without these, an army turns into a crowd of armed people who, sooner or later, cease to be armed and alive. For the Second Shock Army, this flow went through one place, the Myasnoy Bor station, and the narrow-gauge railway laid across the swamp under conditions that were, to put it mildly, unsuitable for normal supply. A narrow-gauge railway is not a main line. It is a temporary track designed for small volumes. For an army of over 80,000 men, it was fundamentally insufficient. According to calculations made later by the historian Sergei Yakovlev, who studied the documents of the main logistics directorate for the first quarter of 1942, the army required about 500 tons of supplies daily. During the best periods, 150 to 200 tons could be transported through the corridor. During the worst, nothing, because the Germans either shelled the routes with artillery or blocked them with airstrikes. This disproportion was known from the very beginning of the operation. It was not eliminated. Why? Because building a proper road through a swamp in winter under combat conditions is months of work and significant resources. They were not available. They chose to start the operation with what they had, hoping for a rapid breakthrough. When a rapid breakthrough did not materialize, the army became a hostage to its own logistical system, which began to be built already during the operation, right under fire. By February 1942, the army was already experiencing an acute shortage of ammunition. By March, of food. By April, the shortage of both had reached a critical point. The daily ration in the army by May ranged from 50 to 80 grams of rusks per person. These are not figures from memoirs. They are recorded in operational reports, some of which were declassified and published in the 90s. 50 grams is roughly one small piece of bread per day, under the physical strain experienced by people in field conditions, under fire in a swamp with full gear. On such a ration, a person does not die instantly. They weaken gradually. First, they lose reaction speed. Then, the capacity for prolonged physical exertion. Then, dystrophic changes begin, which doctors had already recorded during the defense period. By May, thousands of soldiers in the army could no longer move properly due to physical exhaustion. Not from wounds, from hunger. The second part of the logistical catastrophe, ammunition. By May 1942, the Army's artillery had on average 1.5 to 2 units of fire. During active combat operations, a full unit of fire is expended in a few days. That is, artillery commanders had not just limited resources, they practically had no ability to plan fire support. This means that when the Germans tightened the ring and the infantry needed artillery support, it was often not available. Or it was so weak that it could not suppress German firing points. In combat reports for April, May 1942, entries such as the following are regularly found. Attack failed due to lack of artillery support, or attempts to break the encirclement ceased due to ammunition shortage. This is not a catastrophe that happened suddenly. It is a catastrophe that unfolded slowly and which was seen by everyone who looked at the figures. The third element, aviation. German aviation dominated the air over the operation area. Soviet aircraft appeared, but there was no systematic air support that could at least partially compensate for the weakness of ground supply. To understand the scale, the German 18th Corps, operating against the Second Shock Army, had regular air cover and ground attack aircraft support. Soviet troops operated virtually without an air umbrella. Every truck, every cart, every group of soldiers in open space became a target. German pilots knew the location of the corridor and regularly struck it. On one day in May, according to recorded data, German aviation in one raid destroyed several dozen cargo carts moving along the corridor. More than half of the Army's daily supply norm in one raid. And again, this problem was reported. Again, they requested additional fighter aircraft. Again, they received answers that did not solve the problem. Now, about command. There is a temptation to explain the death of the Second Shock Army by the incompetence or cowardice of specific commanders. This is inaccurate. General Kozin, who was later made the main culprit, took over the army at an extremely difficult moment, with a command system he did not build. He commanded an army he did not supply. He made decisions under conditions where real data on the troop situation reached him late and incomplete. This is not an excuse. This is a description of a system in which individual decisions mattered less than is commonly thought. The most critical decision, when to give the order to withdraw, was also not simple. Withdrawing the army from the breakthrough meant admitting the operation to relieve Leningrad had failed. In the conditions of 1942, this admission was not just a tactical conclusion. It was a political act with unpredictable consequences for the commander. Stalin in April-May 1942 did not welcome withdrawals. Directives demanded an offensive. They demanded holding positions. They demanded achieving results. In such a system, a commander who reports, "Withdrawal is impossible, but I request permission to withdraw," risks his career and life. A commander who continues to advance when it is already meaningless at least follows orders. This mechanism worked at all levels. Not only at the level of Kozin or Vlasov, it explains why decisions that needed to be made in March were made in June, when it was already too late. Separately, on intelligence. To understand what was happening, it is important to consider the Soviet command did not have an accurate picture of the German grouping around the corridor. Intelligence data was fragmentary and often delayed. When in April the Germans began preparing a strike against the base of the breakthrough, Soviet intelligence did not fully recognize it. Or recognized it, but the reports were not taken seriously at the required level. The rifle division defending the neck of the corridor on the Soviet side, the 37th, was weak in composition and had limited resources. When the Germans struck, they crushed the defense in a few hours. And again, this was not sudden. The accumulation of German troops at the base of the breakthrough took time. But the time was spent not on strengthening the corridor's defense, but on continuing fruitless attacks deep within the breakthrough. All of this is important to keep in mind when discussing the Army's final weeks. By June of the year 1942, the Second Shock Army had ceased to be a combat-ready formation in the full sense of the word. It still held positions. It still returned fire. It still tried to break through. But these were no longer troops capable of conducting organized combat. These were exhausted, starving people, cut off from normal supply and command, holding on by their last strength. 80,000 in a swamp, without food, without shells, without clear command, and without a clear order on what to do next. Here it is necessary to speak about what was long silenced in this history. After the army's destruction and Vlasov's capture, Soviet propaganda quickly constructed a narrative. The army was betrayed by its commander. Everything else, circumstances that led to this betrayal. Vlasov became a symbol of treason, and this convenient explanation relieved the Soviet command of responsibility for systemic failures. For 30 years, this version was official. It left no room for analysis of logistics, questions about the change of commander in April, about why the order to withdraw was not given for so long. Archives began to open in the 90s. The first serious studies appeared in the late 90s, early 2000s. They showed a picture significantly different from the official one. The destruction of the Second Shock Army is not a story about one traitor. It is a story of how a system, incapable of acknowledging its own mistakes, breaks the people working within it. First, physically, in the swamps near Lyuban, then morally in captivity, then posthumously in official versions of events. There is another aspect that must be mentioned. The army perished, but the task for which it was created, the relief of Leningrad, was not accomplished. Leningrad remained encircled for almost another year after the destruction of the Second Shock. This means that 80,000 people were lost, and yet the strategic situation did not change. The residents of Leningrad continued to die from hunger exactly as they would have died if the Lyuban operation had never happened. Strategically, the operation was a failure twice over. It did not achieve its goal, and it destroyed an army that then had to be replenished from other resources. An understanding of this existed in 42 among part of the military leadership, but it was not made public. It was not recorded in official post-mortems as a systemic failure requiring changes in approach. Instead, they chose an explanation that required no systemic conclusions: betrayal. One last thing to say: Myasnoy Bor. This name is not accidental. In the summer of 42, when the ring closed, several thousand people for several days tried to break through an 800-meter corridor under continuous fire. Of those who broke through in the final days, only a handful reached Soviet positions. What happened in this corridor on the 23rd, 24th of June, 1942, search teams describe based on what they still find to this day. Bones, medallions, weapons, helmets. People walked upright under machine gun fire because they could no longer crawl. Those who fell remained there, on those few hundred meters of swamp. This image, people walking upright under fire because they no longer have the strength to crawl, most accurately describes what the Second Shock Army had become by the end of its existence. Not an army, not a combat formation, people who wanted to get home and who no longer had the strength to do so. 78 years later, they are still being found there. Part 3. Vlasov, the man who became a symbol. In the history of the Second Shock Army, there is one figure that overshadows all others: Andrei Andreevich Vlasov. His name in Soviet historiography became synonymous with betrayal, and this is understandable. He became the commander of the Russian Liberation Army, which fought on the side of Germany. This is a fact that cannot be disputed. But there is a question historians have been asking for decades. What led him to this decision? Vlasov arrived to assume command of the Second Shock Army on the 20th of April, 42. The army had already been encircled for several weeks. Its supply was critically insufficient. Relief attempts had failed. He took command of a doomed force. The question is why he accepted it and why he did not do everything possible to save the men. According to one version, supported by some historians, Vlasov from the very beginning treated the encirclement as a personal catastrophe and thought primarily of his own salvation. According to another, he remained loyal to the end but broke in captivity. Documents show the following. In the final days before the ring was finally closed, Vlasov requested permission to withdraw. He received refusals. He continued to carry out orders. It is important to understand this. He did not flee beforehand. He remained with the army until the end. On the 9th of July, 42, a German patrol discovered Vlasov in the village of Tukovezy, Leningrad Oblast. He was hiding in a barn. Several people were with him. What happened next? German captivity, interrogations, negotiations for collaboration is a separate story. But the key question remains: how did a man who commanded an army come to fight against his own country? There is no definitive answer. There are testimonies given at different times to different people. There are memoirs written after the war. There are versions beneficial to different sides. What is known for certain: Vlasov saw how the system abandoned his army. He saw how thousands of people died not from German superiority, but from Soviet incompetence and the command's indifference. And at some point, he decided that this system was an enemy, no less than Germany. Is this decision correct from a moral point of view? No. It led to people wearing Soviet uniforms being killed by bullets from soldiers of the ROA. But to understand the logic of this decision is to understand something important about what happened in Myasnoy Bor in the summer of 1942. A system that sends an army to die in a swamp without supplies, without air cover, without a real evacuation plan. Such a system sows the seeds of decay long before they sprout. What remains? Myasnoy Bor today is a place known to few. Not Stalingrad, not Kursk, not Leningrad. a small settlement in the Novgorod region near which search teams work every summer. They find remains every year, without exception. Over 70 years after the war ended and the swamp is still giving up its dead. This means the scale of the losses was such that they could not even be collected. People died and remained where they fell. According to official data, the losses of the Second Shock Army amounted to about 50,000 killed and missing. Unofficial estimates are significantly higher. Of the approximately 80,000 people in the pocket at the moment of its final closure, about 16,000 got out. That is 20%. 80% remained in the swamp. And here is what is important. Most of them did not die in battle. They died of hunger, of disease, from exhaustion. They died because the system that sent them to fight could not or did not want to supply them. This is not a defeat. This is annihilation. Instead of a conclusion, the Lyuban operation failed. Leningrad remained under siege for another year and a half. Thousands of people perished in the swamps of the Novgorod region. 20 years later, the official version stated, the army was betrayed by its commander. 30 years later, that the operation was difficult but necessary. 50 years later, that it was a forced step under the difficult conditions of war. Only in the 90s did historians gain access to documents that showed a different picture. The system was making wrong decisions at every level. Logistics were impossible from the start. Supplies were not organized. Retreat was not permitted when it could still have saved people. Vlasov became a symbol of betrayal. It is convenient. It allows one not to ask uncomfortable questions about why the army ended up where it did. Why supplies were not organized. Why the order to retreat was given too late. Myasnoy Bor is a place where people died. Not because of Vlasov, because of decisions made long before he took command. And as long as search teams find bones there every summer, this question remains open. 78 years later, the earth still holds those whom the system could neither feed, nor save, nor bury.